Welcome to another great week on the Ari Goldkind Show. You're going to find this one really interesting, particularly if you're somebody who uses anti-social media. As you know, I refuse to call Twitter social media. It is anti-social media. It makes the world worse. You may have heard in the last number of years of the amount of people who have been canceled and deplatformed off of Twitter for saying things that in 2022 tend to actually be true. Donald Trump was one. He's not necessarily truthful, but kicked off Twitter. He never did anything about it. A number of doctors were kicked off Twitter for saying the vaccines don't work or don't work as promised. Kicked off Twitter. A number of people kicked off Twitter for saying things that are politically incorrect, but are actually correct. Kicked off Twitter. Alex Berenson was a former writer for the New York Times who writes about vaccines and mandates and lockdowns. He was kicked off Twitter for, once again, now that we look at it in 2022, saying things in 2021 that at the time were viewed as forbidden or verboten, but have turned out to be accurate. He was kicked off Twitter. But different than what most people do, he sued Twitter and he won, reinstated back onto Twitter with a settlement of some sort. And our guest tonight for the hour is James Lawrence. Who's James Lawrence? He's the small town Raleigh, North Carolina lawyer who sued Twitter and won. Think about that. James Lawrence, a small town Raleigh, North Carolina lawyer, made fun of, criticized when he launched the suit on behalf of his client, Alex Berenson, sued Twitter and won. So if you've ever wanted to know how you fight back against cancel culture or deplatforming, you're going to enjoy this discussion on this week's episode of the Ari Goldkind Show. Let's get to my opening statement of this week. So much to cover this week. Let's start with what I think has been so woefully unreported. There is no more journalism in this country, at least where people are willing to go after power. Joe Biden, who has had 4 shots of the vaccine, a word being redefined in 2021. It used to mean immunity from a disease. It used to mean not getting infected with a disease. Now it simply means some kind of prophylactic to prevent serious deaths and hospitalizations. You can look this up. But Joe Biden, who had 4 shots of the vaccine, gets COVID twice in the last week, then comes out and again thanks the vaccines and says, see, this proves that they work. Forget the 30 pills of Paxlovid that Pfizer makes as well. This is literally the gaslighting of gaslighting, a word I don't like. But it seems to be we live in an era where if the left or the far left says one thing or accuses you of something, it is them that are guilty of that offense or that ignorance. And when Joe Biden, who 1 year ago said, if you get the vaccine, you will not get COVID, period, you will not get infected. When he gets infected once or twice in the last week, then takes an emergency use 30 pills of Paxlovid, then comes out and says the vaccines work magic, that is literally the fraud of the century. It is so deceitful. It is the very reason we're at a crisis in both Canada and the United States with people, common sense, ordinary, average, intelligent, educated people, people who are not anti-vaxxers, people who are very pro-vaccine. These are people who now don't trust our federal or public health authorities. They don't trust institutions, and no, they're not deplorable. Speaking of the far left and gaslighting, I don't know if it's just me, but maybe you've noticed a trend in the last 2 or 3 years. It's not something 5 years old. It's not something 10 years old. But this trend is taking hold. Have you noticed now that everything that the left disagrees with, or the far left, depending on your preference, everything the left disagrees with, every opinion that disagrees with what the left says is the orthodoxy is now called hate speech. You may have opened up a number of Canada's newspapers this week and seen all sorts of articles talking about anybody who criticizes the Trudeau government or any issue around any hot button political issue right now is emanating hate speech. I actually misspoke, heat, but hate speech emanating out of their pores. This way of silencing people, which we've seen through Tamara Leach, we've seen through the Emergencies Act, we've seen through the Freedom Convoy, we've seen through every institution that doesn't say, okay, you have your point, we'll show you why you're wrong, we'll show you what the science, data, and evidence says. Instead, the argument now everywhere, and this is now in major Canadian newspapers, is to call speech that is anything other than hateful, anything other than advocating hatred, anything other than advocating genocide, which if you look up hate speech is actually what the definition is. But now the left silences everything and everybody and every common sense viewpoint by simply labeling speech they disagree with hate speech. If that isn't in and of itself more hateful and arguably far more fascist, a term that most people don't even understand the definition of, or the left not being able to look in the mirror and saying and seeing for themselves what hate actually looks like. Whatever you want to call it, what's going on throughout North America and Canada right now is not hate speech when the institutions and the power of the left is questioned. And it is incredible whether you watch our journalism base in Canada or whether you watch the White House briefing room, where nobody other than one reporter for Fox News named Peter Doocy dares to ask hard questions, to push back. We're in a situation now where the left are asking for people to be arrested because they simply annoy other people. And if you don't believe me, look at the viral video out of England last week, where a man was arrested in his home because a tweet he retweeted, and I emphasize this, a tweet he retweeted annoyed somebody. I'm being serious. Annoyed somebody. A tweet he retweeted annoyed somebody. He wasn't, for example, kicked off Twitter, which we'll talk about with our guest later tonight, but he was actually arrested for annoying somebody. This is the agenda of the left and the far left, to silence their critics. Can you show me any mainstream conservative or right-wing outlet that says as follows: nobody is allowed to disagree with us. We want to shut down the opinion of people who disagree with us. We will not debate or engage with people who disagree with us. And people who disagree with us should be deplatformed and put in jail. Take your time, think of somebody prominent who says that. And then do your research, if you'd like, and look at how many national figures in North America call for the utter silencing, deplatforming, and disappearing of people who disagree with the positions of the far left. You may have seen in this attempt to control speech, which they are very successful at, by the way, the far left. They are extraordinarily successful at it, whether it be Tamara Leach or freezing the bank accounts of ordinary average Canadians who pay $25 or $50 to causes that Justin Trudeau doesn't like. The issue of language is critical. And you may have seen in the last week or two the definition of recession being redefined. Somehow, when Republicans are in charge, a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. But as soon as it's the Biden or a left or far left administration, that isn't the definition of recession anymore. Again, it's the rules for thee and not for me crowd. And it is astounding because nobody in a prominent place, a prominent figure, pushes back. You almost have to go to cable news to a certain show at 8 o'clock for anybody to demonstrate that they have the guts or the courage to actually talk about the third rail issues, which should be issues that every single ordinary citizen gets to talk about without being told that you don't count, you don't have a vote, you don't have a voice, you don't have meaning in your life. When people are told to be quiet, to shut up, to not exercise the freedom of their conscience, that deprives people of meaning. And one of the more serious things that we've seen in this country, in the Western world, is where an entire ideology of people have been silenced, not because they're wrong, but because they're right, pun intended. And that correctness threatens the power of the left. Look at what Beyonce did earlier this week. Beyonce, who ticks all of the right demographic checkboxes, had to change one or two words in her album, in a song, because it offended the ableist community. Now, anybody who knows me knows I am probably one of the bigger and outspoken advocates of disabled, handicapped, paralyzed people on the planet. It's something that I live and breathe in my conscience. But the idea that anybody should be able to censor the expression, the artistic expression of what an artist writes about in song, music, poem, sculpture, you really, if you want to see somebody speak about this more eloquently than I, go to Dave Chappelle's brand new special on Netflix, where he talks about the inanity and the insanity of people trying to censor how he speaks and the freedom of his artistic expression as a comic/artist. When the biggest star in the world kowtows, and that's what it is, nobody can convince me this is genuine or of the heart, where she was offending somebody by using the word spaz, which has a number of meanings, none of them demeaning or derogatory. But when the biggest music star in the world, who is protected by her privilege, her demographic, kowtows to 5 people on Twitter, it should tell you something. And if it makes Beyonce back down and change how she speaks and expresses herself artistically, what hope is there for the rest of us? One of the things that bothered me last week, and I'm sure you may have noticed it, is the president of Ukraine posing with his wife for one of the most sickening, out-of-touch Vogue profiles ever. I don't know why more people aren't outspoken against the war in Ukraine. I don't know why more people aren't outspoken that this Zelensky is no hero. 1 or 2 years from now, we're going to be able to talk about the truth about this man. The same way that a year ago or 2 years ago, we couldn't talk about Hunter Biden until the election was passed, the damage is done, and we all now know what a scumbag he is, was, and forever will be. Zelensky is a fraud. In my business as a criminal defense lawyer, you follow the money. Everything always leads to the money. And when you have this person meeting with the Bonos, the Ben Stillers, the Lindsey Grahams, the warmongers, the military-industrial complex, while he presides over one of the more corrupt governments in the history of Europe, and he takes pallets of cash, billions at a time, and nobody knows where the money is going, why the Western world or Western media has made this man a hero is beyond me. But if that tone-deaf Annie Leibovitz Vogue cover wasn't anything other than a tone-deaf, disgusting exercise that I don't even understand isn't disgusting for his own people, the Ukrainian people, who are legitimately suffering. This tells you, again, everything you need to know about a certain side of the political aisle. They are shameless. They know they can do anything they want to do, and they know they will get away with it. And it is absolutely shameless. It's very interesting for me as somebody who doesn't watch football, who doesn't care about the NFL, who stopped watching the NBA 3 years ago, to look at the case of a man named Deshaun Watson. Now, if you don't know who he is, let me tell you who Deshaun Watson is. Deshaun Watson is an NFL player, probably pretty good at his job, because that allows you to get away with anything as a person of certain demographics and abilities in the United States. Accused of sexually misconduct or sexual misconduct, but sexual abuse kinds of claims of 30 different women, 30. He has settled over 20 of those, which means paid checks. Do you know how many players in the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball have been suspended for smoking weed or betting $50 on a game, or Pete Rose or 10 other players I won't bore you with? They get banned for a year or two. Deshaun Watson was suspended for 6 games. 30 women accusing him of misconduct. He settles or pays out with about 20 of them, and he gets a 6-game suspension. Who has the privilege in our world? Who really has the privilege? You, listening to this on Sirius XM, Canada Talks Channel 167? You, the ordinary average Canadian or American going about your job, raising your family? Think you would be able to keep your job if 0.3 women accused you of sexual misconduct, 1.3 women, 3 women, 13 women, let alone 30? But because Deshaun Watson has a privilege that he and his side will tell you you have, meanwhile, of which you don't, Deshaun Watson gets a 6-game suspension from the NFL. Why? Because he's good at a certain game, or because of he's a certain demographic? A demographic that can do things that another demographic cannot do, that would be pilloried and raked over the coals if somebody of a different demographic asked somebody out. But Deshaun Watson is special. Do you know who isn't viewed as special in our world anymore? You. And it's sickening. A story that's a little bit more dry, but one that I think is still very important, is you may have read about, and if you didn't, you should, about the number of big real estate companies or funds or pension funds or hedge funds buying mobile park homes, mobile trailer homes in the States, and kicking out Americans who have the least, who struggle to make ends meet, who try and be able to afford to live in a mobile home. You may know that there's a Canadian company buying up single-family dwellings all throughout Canada in the GTA, hedge funds buying single-family homes. If we had politicians in this country and south of the border who gave a lick about the middle class or the lower middle class, and who all didn't live in gated communities with their own private security, it would be immediately legislated that these hedge funds can't buy single-family homes that are already out of price for the most of you, but they also wouldn't be able to buy up mobile homes and mobile trailers that house the poorest amongst us. That's my opening statement. Back in 2 minutes. How to sue Twitter and how to win. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks Channel 167. Very rarely do I want to talk to another lawyer. No, I mean that as a joke. But yes, very rarely, other than a very close friend of mine, do I want to talk to another lawyer. James Lawrence is a very different kind of lawyer. So for all of you listening on Sirius who use anti-social media, James, I don't call it social media, and who have ever thought Twitter is ridiculous, insane, cancel culture personified, a wing of the government, and who have seen people they follow get canceled, deplatformed, whether it be the bad orange man or anybody else dealing with COVID, James Lawrence is a lawyer in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he has just represented and succeeded in getting the notorious AB, that's Alex Berenson. I'm trying to make a lighthearted, humorous joke there. And if you don't know who Alex Berenson is, James represented Alex, who was deplatformed and canceled off of Twitter for telling the truth about vaccines, asking questions, talking about mandates, talking about the FDA. Twitter banned him. James took his case, and James won. James Lawrence from Envisage Law, great to have you on the show.
Ari, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I hope you don't mind that long-winded introduction, but it's because I'm really impressed with what you did. So instead of me talking, tell us a little bit about who Alex Berenson is, how you came to be involved in his case, going after the monster that's Twitter, and what your life has been like doing that. Take as much time as you want. I'm riveted by the story, and I think our listeners will be too.
Yeah, happy to. So Alex is an independent journalist who has a rather significant following on his Substack, Unreported Truths, where he covers COVID-19, vaccine-related issues, and a number of other things as well. And Alex is actually a former New York Times reporter. He's somebody who investigated various aspects of the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry here in the United States. Somebody who actually produced front page material for the Times while he was there. So he has a deep background as a journalist, wrote a book called Pandemia, which is available for, you can find it at your local bookstore perhaps, but it's a chronicle of the governmental response, the public policy response to COVID-19. So he's written about that. He's also a successful fiction author as well. So in terms of how I connected with Alex, I was privileged to serve as an attorney in the Trump administration, in the Department of Health and Human Services, in the Office of the General Counsel.
Probably never a dull day under that administration.
No, it was I'll tell you, Ari, I mean, I was sitting in my living room in March of 2020 watching the press conference, press conferences, plural, unfold with respect to the start of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, to go from watching that on television to actually serving in the administration was not something that I would have expected would have happened. Very, very fortunate, very blessed to have had that experience. And so I served through the end of President Trump's term. At the very end of his term, at the tail end of his term, I was promoted to be the chief counsel of the Food Drug Administration, the FDA, and served in that capacity for around 10 days. I don't want to overstate what I did there, but I was the outgoing chief counsel of the FDA under President Trump. And I came to that position and really serving in the Trump administration by way of background as a commercial lawyer, representing corporations in litigation, transactional matters, and regulatory issues, primarily in the healthcare industry.
And how did you find Alex? Because I know you were following him. A lot of people were. He was on Twitter. He was often on Tucker Carlson,
right,
depending on your news outlet. Are you following him? Are you reading him? Are you skeptical of him? And how do you come to get in touch with him?
Well, I had followed Alex and become aware of his work on the COVID pandemic really very early, maybe even March of 2020. He was one of the few voices that were asking questions about the lockdowns. He was asking questions about why schools were closing. You know, and at that time, I was actually active in my large commercial law firm with a partner of mine who I now work with at Envisage in fighting back against the COVID mandates. So we represented protesters here in Raleigh against the governor of North Carolina, who had tried to shut down the anti-lockdown protests on the grounds that they were a threat to public health. We threatened to sue the governor and actually got him to back down successfully, and the protests went on. So we were doing legal work. I was doing legal work and others with me to push back against the COVID mandates. And so, again, I was interested in what he was doing primarily because he was one of the very few people that were out there actually, again, questioning as a journalist should.
Cross-examining, so to speak.
Cross-examining, right. Asking why, why is it that that we've shuttered schools? Why is it, for instance, here in North Carolina, large box retailers were operating throughout the beginning of the pandemic, but a small shop owned by a mom and pop couldn't because of COVID-19.
I've asked that many times. Amazon, Walmart, Costco.
Right.
But continue.
Right. Exactly.
I want to get to Alex. Yep.
Yep. So again, I connected with him many months later in the summer of 2021, really around some of the reporting that he was doing around FDA and emergency use authorizations. And again, I come at it from a perspective as a complex commercial lawyer who has advised clients on FDA regulated or FDA related issues. And so I just offered to be a resource to him, and we connected, and I suppose the rest is history.
All right, so let's get to that, because this is the part where it gets really interesting. So in August of 2021, is it 2020 he's banned or 2021?
2021, August 28th, 2021.
All right, so let me read to people the tweet that gets him banned from Twitter. And for Canadians listening to us, or wherever you're listening to us in the Sirius world, open up a newspaper today and remind yourself and remember how yesterday's disinformation or misinformation is today's truth. Here's the tweet that gets him banned. Then we'll get into you suing Twitter and what in the world that's like, because that's what brought me to you or you to me. Quote, "It doesn't stop infection or transmission. Don't think of it as a vaccine. Think of it at best as a therapeutic with a limited window of efficacy and terrible side effect profile that must be dosed in advance of illness. And we want to mandate it, ? Insanity," end quote. That's the tweet. That's now today's information. It's the cover of every newspaper in Canada, which 6 months ago would have got you deplatformed. Doesn't work against Omicron. This, that, and the other. We were told that, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. It'll prevent you from getting it. It'll prevent you from spreading all of this. He gets banned from Twitter. You get involved. How in the world does a Raleigh, North Carolina lawyer sue California Twitter?
Well, it really is. You put on your hat as a litigator, as a problem solver. Somebody who has been on the other side, having represented companies, and you come up with various theories of liability. We had 8 counts in the complaint, and if you've read it,
I want you to explain it to people. People listen to you. They don't know James Lawrence. They don't know you in Raleigh, North Carolina. They know you took on a monolith, a gorilla, the biggest of the biggest. Just simplify it. I don't want us to sound like two lawyers talking. Just explain to people who are fascinated that you made Twitter backtrack.
I mean, again, part of it is it's using Twitter's own words against it. I think scripture talks about the sometimes people can get caught up in their own words, and in many ways that's what happened here.
You mean
Twitter, as a large corporation, multi-billion-dollar corporation, actually enunciated and promulgated a policy that governed the speech around COVID-19. And it said explicitly and specifically what constitutes a violation of the policy. There were 3 elements in the misinformation policy, which to my knowledge is still posted on their website and enforced today. And 2 of those 3 elements, just quickly, one is you have to make an actual assertion of fact. And then the third element, that's got to be misleading or false. And the third element requires some public health harm or harm to the public or threat to health. And going back to Mr. Berenson tweeted on August, I believe it was 27th or 28th, 2021, that it doesn't stop the spread, it doesn't stop an infection. Well, to the extent that's an assertion of fact, was demonstrated when he made the statement in August of 2021. There were public health officials here in the United States who conceded that studies and research had showed that it was true. It was fact. And in terms of the other pieces of his statement, which again, to go back to Twitter's policy also expressly protects opinion. And you might agree or disagree with Alex's characterization of the side effect profile of the vaccines or his view on vaccine mandates. That's separate and apart from the question of whether or not what he said actually violated the policy. And when you line all 5 of his strikes up against what Twitter itself deemed to be COVID misinformation, it fails.
But isn't this an argument that many people have made against Twitter and lost in some area? I mean, there's something more that you did and you knocked down more of their arguments because so many people have said things are true and get deplatformed or opinion. What was different about this?
I think what was different, Ari, is that they staked a claim on the issue. They staked out a position on what is and what is not COVID misinformation. They said it has to be these 3 things. It can't be opinion. They have other policies, as you might be aware, such as their hateful conduct policy, which is more ambiguous, more amorphous.
It's speech they don't like and the people that work there don't like. That's what I think.
Yes, one could certainly infer that from the contents of the policy. But I think what our case was successful in doing, again, was lining up what they said with what they said was actually, or what Alex said with what they actually said was misinformation. Now, I will say, and this is again all in the public record, you can go pull the briefs if you are interested or your listeners are interested. And quite frankly, we'd like to get those on our website.
You're just cutting out there, James. So I'm going to take a quick break just to let James reset the internet. I want to have him at his best. So we're going to take a quick break, back in 2 minutes on the Ari Goldkind Show. We're going to continue talking about James Lawrence and Alex Berenson against Twitter. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks Channel 167. We're with James Lawrence of Envisage Law, who took on Twitter and got his man Alex Berenson, who was spitting and spewing truth for the last couple of years back. When we were going to break, James, we were talking about how you do that. Let me ask you a question. How satisfied do you feel with this result as a lawyer?
Very grateful.
Well, how do you think it came to be? Do you think you found a hole in the matrix? Do you think they got out lawyered? How do you think this came to be?
I think, Ari, part of it is you stand on the shoulders of people that have gone before, as you know, right? Like the great people of the past, whether it's Newton or you think about people who are working on problems in parallel, right? Like Edison or Tesla. When you think of the great discoveries of the late 1800s, early 1900s, people working in parallel. So I'm not the only person that has tried to make these claims. And there have been a number of people who have gone before making those claims. Adam Candeweb, for example, at Michigan State, who was one of my former Trump administration colleagues, has been writing in this space for probably more than a decade about the interplay between Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is how these platforms typically justify their censorship.
Explain to people, let me just pause you there. Explain to people who aren't familiar with that. That's their way of saying, we're just a host, we're just a computer website, this, that, and the other. Dumb that down, and I mean that even to me. Dumb down or explain in layman's terms what 230 is and how the tech companies use it to control speech and to prevent accountability for when they control who gets to talk.
Yeah, so 230, and I'm sure there's an analogous law in Canada, but it basically was passed in 1996 to allow, to immunize message boards, let's say, back in the early days of the internet. Let's say somebody posts something on the message board that is false and defamatory.
Yeah.
It's fair to hold the individual poster accountable for that defamation, but the Congress here in the U.S. made the decision. It's not fair, really. It's not. It shouldn't be illegal. It shouldn't be something that a message board host has to pay damages for. With respect to defamation.
Now, you can understand that, James,
example,
going back 15, 20, 25 years when there were dot matrix printers. It's a different world today, fair?
It is, and one could make the case that was under the assumption, for example, that the message board provider was really incapable, didn't have the technology to monitor that speech and to
nonpartisan,
get it off. What's that?
And nonpartisan.
Yeah. Well, and again, the actual statute itself talks about how the preamble to it, that this statute is supposed to further free expression, further speech, not inhibit speech.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And again, it was really there to block that scenario I just mentioned to you, and to also incentivize providers of interactive computer programs or interactive platforms to take off truly abhorrent material,
right.
Truly profane, truly pornographic stuff.
Right.
Not to censor debate and discussion about the most pressing public questions
that are not defamatory, that are not provably wrong, that are not misinformation, right, other than somebody's on one side and on the other. So you take this on, Mr. Berenson retains you. What's it like as a Raleigh, North Carolina lawyer to go against that juggernaut? Is it something that you worry about bankrupting you? Is it something that you don't worry about that? How do you think about that mountain to climb as a lawyer?
Well, at the end of the day, Ari, Proverbs 16:33 says that the lot is in your lap, but every move is from the Lord. I truly believe that. And I live my life in that way. I order my life and my affairs in that way. So in my mind, taking the case on was the right thing to do. Taking on the juggernaut, as you said, was the right thing to do. And I will do what's right according to what I know is right, and leave the results to God. I'm sure when David was confronting Goliath in front of the Philistine army that it seemed insurmountable, but truly I believe this. There's no barrier that's insurmountable to God. I truly, that's my view.
Which is an interesting view as a lawyer, because I'm a big believer in the separation of church and state. You're practicing something literally in a state courthouse. So there's a lot of interesting questions there. But what I want to ask is this, you, just for people who aren't familiar with you, you were doing normal business to business disputes, normal litigation, normal work as a commercial, corporate commercial litigation lawyer. We won't get into what that really means, but for this. Did this one put a bee in your bonnet, a zip in your step? Because to me, this would be, and you're a very young man. How old are you?
I'm 37.
Right, you're a very young man. This to me would be the case of the century that comes to you when you're 34 or 35 or 36. Did you feel the gravity of it, or was it just another day at the office?
No, you do feel the gravity of it, for sure, because this is such a critical issue. This is such an important issue, and it really comes home for me too, because in parallel to representing Alex in his case against Twitter, I had the privilege and the opportunity to come alongside dozens and dozens and dozens of people who made the decision personally that they did not want to take one of the COVID-19 vaccines, and
Right.
their livelihood was on the line. So the whole situation with the mandates and the lockdowns and the masking and the inconsistency and just the whole thing, certainly you feel the gravity of that.
When did
and you try to meet the moment as best you can.
When did you really get a sense that you're making progress here, that Twitter isn't going to, pun intended, shut you down or be able to shut your case down? When did you realize, holy mackerel, I'm going to succeed here, or I'm not going to lose here? What was that epiphany or that moment like?
That's a great question, Ari, and I'll tell you, because when this lawsuit was filed, it was not well received. Let's just put it that way, by the critical legal community.
Yeah, let me just I'm going to interrupt you there on purpose. Let me just, because you're a very modest guy. When I looked you up and did my research on you, the #2 search on Twitter of you, other than your law firm, is a mouth breather making basic fun of you for taking the case on, and making fun of Tucker Carlson for saying, I'll pay Alex Berenson's legal fees, and, saying what a losing argument it is. And it's the normal mouth breathing kinds of arguments that, why are you doing this? This has been litigated. This is stupid. So back to my question about what it's like, that really informs why I asked you that, because, if you're a biblical person and believe in God, and I'm not of that, I'm proudly Jewish, but not religious, but you stayed the course. What did that feel like? So back to the epiphany when you go, really the mouth breathers are not going to win here.
Well, you always hope for the best, and you put your best foot forward, and you do the best that you can in all circumstances and all things. And I certainly, and the team that was around me, it just wasn't me, by the way, it was my partner at Envisage, Tony Biller, Sean Gates, who is a lawyer at Karis Lex in Los Angeles area. And others, family.
It takes a village. It takes a village. Right? You're very generous. It takes a village.
It does.
But you're the guy here.
And so I'll tell you the story real quickly. I actually was very fortunate to be able to take my 8-year-old son to the hearing in San Francisco.
Yes.
So we homeschool before the pandemic. And I said, to my wife, really, there's no better education that he's going to get than to go to San Francisco and watch his dad, put it all on the line with Twitter in this hearing on the motion to dismiss. And so we had a very adventurous road out to San Francisco, getting in very, very late the night before the hearing. And then we went into Judge William Alsup's courtroom the very next morning. You're fighting the time change, the fatigue. Obviously you're in for a difficult time. Judge Alsup is a very, very well-known federal judge. And certainly Twitter's lawyers are impressive and have accomplished a lot in their careers. But I think that, you leave that courtroom, and a lot of people make fun of some of the claims that were in the complaint. I think some folks have said that the claims were laughed out of court. I would just encourage them at some point to read the transcript for themselves of what happened during the motion to dismiss hearing, because it was very clear within really the first 5 minutes of the first 5 minutes of the hearing that the judge was very interested in the claims that we had raised. And I believe at one point he even asked Twitter's lawyer, how are you going to get around this complaint? Which you're sitting there in the courtroom, and certainly you had to smile, at least to myself, in that regard. But I think after we left that hearing, we believe we had a chance of success on at least some of the claims in terms of getting past the motion to dismiss, which
Right.
is the first step along the road of any civil case. If you can't get past that, you can't get any further. And so we left the courtroom, and I took my son down with my father-in-law down to Fisherman's Wharf. We had some fish and chips, and the
Yep.
next day we were driving down the Pacific Coast Highway, and the order came in that we had gotten past the motion to dismiss on two of the 8 claims. So
So that must have been a very,
surreal. It was a surreal experience, to a truly unforgettable experience, to be pulled off on the side of the road somewhere between San Francisco and Big Sur on the Pacific Coast Highway, trying to get reception to read what the judge had done.
Did you think at that point you might be able to afford the Post Ranch Inn in the future? That's an inside joke. I don't know if you got that one. That's the most expensive hotel in Big Sur, which a guy like you knows differently. So we have to wind down. We have very little time left. So let's just do a couple quick lightning rounds, because I don't want to let you go without having people get an understanding where this goes. Does that lead to the settlement where Twitter essentially said, we're going to put this to bed, reinstate him, and the terms will be confidential?
Well, yes, certainly, and this is public record. After the motion dismissed, the parties got involved in extended settlement discussions, which ultimately yielded a confidential settlement.
And I've seen Alex Berenson talk about how he'll talk about that in the future based on what he is and isn't able to do. For you, and a quick question, is this the kind of work you're going to continue doing because you've just developed a reputation as somebody who's done the impossible? Or do you intend to just go back to what you were doing before, or a bit of both?
Well, I still do commercial work, and I was doing commercial work throughout the time I was representing Alex too. So I do plan to continue to represent companies and to represent individuals. And yes, I mean, there have been folks that have reached out to seek representation on these censorship issues. We were actually successful in representing Dr. Andrew Bostom, another person who's published things about the COVID vaccines, who was suspended, and we wrote a demand letter to Twitter on his behalf, and he was reinstated and put back on the platform.
Well, that's really interesting when you look at that you've had this power that even the bad orange man president can't get himself on, and he tries to save face by saying, I wouldn't go back on if they let me. Something tells me he should have probably hired you instead of Rudy Giuliani.
Well, again, so many things are outside of your control, as you know, as an attorney. You can't control everything. You do the best that you can, and in my case, truly, Ari, that's what I believe. I did the best that I could. I left the results to God at the end of the day. Proverbs 16:33 is true.
And to me, this has such an interesting, movie-like quality to it. The lawyer from a smaller town. Raleigh's not small. I know what a great city it is. I was just in South Carolina a few months ago. I know how great that part of the world is, but there's something just very prophetic in other biblical terms. And as you mentioned, David and Goliath. One last question. We only have about 60 seconds left for your answer, but I'd be remiss, given that people know I'm a criminal defense lawyer. They know I'm talking to a lawyer. They know I almost never have lawyers on the show, but your story is so fantastically interesting. Civility in our world is, in my view, long lost. People are enemies. They don't realize they disagree. They think they must scorch the earth and hate each other. What was the relationship like for you with the lawyers on the other side? Was it respectful? Were they demeaning to you? Were they respectful of you? Did they look down on you because you're a Raleigh lawyer, sort of like Tom Cruise in The Firm, where, he's going to the small town, not the crooked Gene Hackman firm that we all know from the movie. But what was the civility like as you dealt with these white shoe law firms at $1,500 US an hour versus you? I'm just curious, but we don't have a lot of time, but it's certainly interesting to me as a lawyer.
Yeah, it was a civil relationship. It was definitely a civil relationship, but you're right, Ari. we have to, as Americans, Canadians, really throughout the world, we have to be able to sit down and have discussions and break bread with people and look across the table and understand that if we can't talk, if we can't have speech, if we can't have actual debate, it's not in anybody's interest for that to be the case. So you're right. We have to reinstitute civility, respect, and quite frankly, love for our fellow man and woman at the end of the day.
Well, that's a long lost lesson, and I wish more people would have it who disagree. I always, James, go back to when I was younger. I'm older than you. I'm 48. When I was growing up, I watched Crossfire, where people would debate each other vociferously about political issues. They would disagree till the cows come home. And you absolutely knew for certain that after the taping on CNN was done, they were all going out for dinner together. And I always say our world needs more of that. James Lawrence, Raleigh, North Carolina, Envisage Law. If you've ever wanted to take on Twitter, don't waste his time unless you have a really good case. But to me, he's the guy to me that has set the standard now and has done an unbelievable job. James, great to have you on. I really appreciate it. I wish you good luck in your career. This has been the Ari Goldkind Show on Canada Talks, channel 167, Sirius XM. I want to thank everybody for listening to me and James talk law. And hopefully there are messages to you, not only in James taking on Goliath, but James's view in a higher power and doing the right thing when you believe in the cause. Have a good week, everybody. Back next week with a brand new show.